This is Land of Havilah, Proverbs 5. From start to finish, it's a warning against committing adultery. Verse 1. My son, pay attention to my wisdom. Turn your ear to my understanding, that you may maintain discretion, that your lips may preserve knowledge. For the lips of an adulteress drip honey. Her mouth is smoother than oil, but in the end she's as bitter as wormwood and as sharp as a two-edged sword. Comment in verses 1 and 2, pay attention that you maintain discretion, that your lips may preserve knowledge. In other words, understand this, please, so that your thoughts and speech on the subject of adultery are accurate. In verse 4, wormwood isn't what it sounds. It's not wood with wormholes in it. Wormwood's a herbaceous, leafy, low-growing, non-woody plant known for its bitter leaves. The Hebrew word translated wormwood comes from a root that means to curse. In verses 4 and 5, the adulteress is like honey and oil at first, but in the end she's bitter as wormwood and sharp as a two-edged sword, which means she turns out to be the opposite of what she was at first. She turns out to be a deadly, bitter curse. Speaking of the adulteress, verse 5, her feet go down to death, her steps lead straight to Sheol. She gives no thought to the way of life. Her ways are crooked, and she doesn't know it. Now therefore, my sons, listen to me. Don't depart from the words of my mouth. Remove your way far from her. Don't come near the door of her house, lest you give your honor to others and your years to the cruel one, lest strangers feast on your wealth, and your labors enrich another man's house. Comment, consequences of adultery include a bitter end in verse 4 and death in verse 5. So how does adultery end in death? Death here is either a result so bitter the adulterer wishes he was dead, or it's spiritual death, or even physical death resulting from murder by a jealous husband, or even, we know now, there can be death from venereal disease. And the consequences include moral corruption in verse 6, quote, her ways are crooked. And in verse 9, there's a forfeiture of honor, quote, you give your honor to others. We saw a president of the U.S. lose his honor over adultery. And in verse 9, you give your years to the cruel one. In other words, adultery can wreck your life, your years. You might lose your spouse, your children, and even if you don't lose them totally, the relationships have been weakened. One act of adultery traumatizes the entire family, and even beyond their lifetimes, it might set up a generational weakness for adultery. A person has to think about all those dominoes up front. When you tip that first domino, look out. Commit adultery and maybe say goodbye to your spouse, children, money, house. Move out and send your income to them for the rest of your life. They'll demand your financial support and get it, and refuse you and your affections, all within their legal rights. You'll have no recourse. Your laborers will enrich another man's house in verse 10. It's the same now as it was in Solomon's time. Your ex may take up another man, probably will take up another man. Either he'll live with her in your house that you paid for, or they'll sell the house and take the money, and you'll still send checks for child support. But she and her husband will spend the checks, maybe for the children, maybe not. You'll enrich another man's house in verse 10. And to think how many people never read this because they think the Bible's not relevant. Verse 11. You'll groan at your latter end when your flesh and your body are consumed, and say, how I've hated instruction, and my heart despised reproof. Neither have I obeyed the voice of my teachers, nor turned my ear to those who instructed me. I've come to the brink of utter ruin among the gathered assembly. Comment in verse 14 is started in the dark but ended in the public, with the gathered assembly knowing the adulterer's utter ruin. Now concerning not just adultery but all sex outside marriage, verse 15. Drink water out of your own cistern, running water out of your own well. Should your springs overflow in the streets, streams of water in the public squares, let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers with you. Let your spring be blessed. Rejoice in the wife of your youth, a loving doe and a graceful deer. Let her breasts satisfy you at all times. Be captivated always with her love. For why should you, my son, be captivated with an adulteress? Why embrace the bosom of another? Comment, there's been no mention of God so far, only the earthly consequences of adultery. But now, verse 21. For the ways of man are before Yahweh's eyes. He examines all his paths. The evil deeds of the wicked ensnare him. The cords of his sin hold him firmly. He'll die for lack of instruction. In the greatness of his folly, he'll go astray. Comment in verse 22, the cords of his sin hold him firmly, meaning he can't undo the damage. In verse 23, the summary is that adultery is great folly. Proverbs 6 is next.